Well, good evening and welcome to our midweek service here at Calvary Baptist Church. Glad to have you with us this evening. I don't know about you, but these last months and really years in our political life are unprecedented in my experience. And even from my study of American history, I'm not sure we've encountered such political conflict and strife since the time of the Civil War. Maybe there's been some moments here or there, but sustained conflict politically keeps going on and on. I have to admit, when we were approaching the election here in last November, I was not looking forward to it. I really couldn't see how anything good was going to happen. I thought no matter what the result was, I probably wasn't going to like it. And I'm not sure whether my fears came true or not, or that, but I think a lot of us were probably not very confident that our country's in good shape and going in a good direction, and maybe more concerned than we've had, at least in my recollection of our political life. I expect then when we feel that sense of tensions and conflict and not really seeing resolution to it, we might give way to sustained fear. We might give way to a troubledness of soul that could maybe upset our lives. Maybe we actually consciously worry about it. Perhaps maybe we dread conversations with people. Maybe we don't even sleep as well. I'm not sure what your experience is. I know whenever I face those kinds of kind of big uncertainties that are bigger than my ability to do anything about them and bigger than your ability to do anything about them, one of the books I love to go to in the Bible is the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is a book that's written to a people that are just fretting worldliness. Worldliness meaning that set of powers that act as if God either doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he doesn't really change anything in the practical affairs of life. That is worldliness meaning this system, kind of a horizontal level system where there's push and pull and there's different human powers, some to rise in prominence, others seem to be suppressed in defeat or subjection to the higher powers. And of course, that worldly system is what the world knows. That's what the broader world thinks in terms of. And the people that Isaiah is writing to are people really trapped in worldliness. They can't see the eternal. They can't see God. They can't see how God makes a difference. All they can think of is how to manage the fears of this life. All they can think of is how to find security. Maybe it's not a great security, but a little bit of security. And Isaiah is really written to a people to stretch their imaginations beyond the world to see how God is trustworthy. And so it's an extended call for a people to trust the Lord and not to trust their fears, or not to let their fears run rampant. Where I'd like to focus our attention this evening in thinking about this is the early section. Really, the whole book of Isaiah is about this subject, but chapters 6 through 8 are a particular slice of that book that kind of summarizes a lot of its main themes. And I'd like to focus my attention first at chapter 7. And chapter 7 of Isaiah is the historical situation is that there are armies that have descended upon Jerusalem. The nation of Judah, the capital city of Jerusalem, has been attacked and is being laid siege to by a couple of other nations. And the king of Judah at this time is a king named Ahaz. And Ahaz is beyond his ability. He is beyond his power. He has no secret weapon that he can call on. He feels the threat of the invading powers. And so he's in this position of worldliness, that the world has surrounded him, and all he can really see is the world. He doesn't see any hope outside of it. And so God sends his prophet Isaiah to Ahaz to stir him up with a bigger view of God. In this, I think we see a picture of the wider book of Isaiah and probably the wider case of life. That worldliness can hem us in and can feel threatening and suffocating, like a city under siege. And we might be able to relate to Ahaz, who feels like all there is chaos, and all there is this threat of something terrible happening. And so God sends Isaiah to speak to this. And the first part really that we see in chapter 7 is a picture of the world. And the picture of the world is a picture of fear. A picture of fear dominating. Look with me at the text, if you could take your Bible and turn to Isaiah chapter 7, beginning in verse number 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told to the house of David, saying, Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim. So his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods are moved with the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out now and meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the aqueduct, from the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field. And say to him, Take heed and be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted. For these two stubs of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin in Syria and the son of Remaliah, because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have plotted evil against you. Let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and set a king over them, the son of Tabel. So you see the setting of the context here of Jerusalem and Ahaz in the grip of fear. These two powers, the nation of Israel of the north and the king of Syria further north, have besieged them. And at first they attacked and they couldn't quite do it, but it just seems to be a matter of time before these enemy powers are going to overtake them. And the context is one of fear. And notice the kind of poetic and kind of interesting description, the analogy that's given in verse number 2. So his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods are moved with the wind. So we're talking about great fear. We're talking about the fear of the soul, that this is deep. And they are just being blown like leaves or like small trees being blown in a strong wind. And they can't resist. And so fear is shaking them. Fear is shaking their soul. When the world becomes chaotic and the world becomes against us and threatening, it just can produce a fear that sometimes literally shakes, but distracts us from the peace that God wants us to have, that God aspires for us and plans for us and really secures for us. So Ahaz and his people are shaking with a great fear. And this fear is partly because of the rage. Notice the emphasis on the anger of the people. In verse number 4, where we read about the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah. So the people are raging against them. And of course, that's one of the keys to winning battles is to express rage, to scare your enemy. Part of the battle plan is if you make your enemy scared enough, you weaken them, you demoralize them. They might just give up even before you have to do anything. And so fearsome images, fearsome words. So the world's threatening Ahaz, and he is giving way. He hears and he sees the rage of the people. It is interesting how the world is fascinated with fear and with bad news. If I just was wanting to make money by writing a book, every now and then my kids tell me, Dad, you should write a book, and I don't really have an interest in writing a book, but they say you should write a book. If I was ever going to write a book, and let's say I didn't really think spiritually, I just thought, I want to make money. If I was going to write a book that would make money, I would write a book about how terrible everything is. It just seems like that's a surefire way to sell a book. You just talk about how all these bad things are happening, and this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and prophets of doom. It seems like there's always a market to, people apparently want to be afraid, and so if you can stir up people with thoughts of threatening things and a view of this problem, that problem, my guess is you can sell a few books that way. I'm not going to write that book, but it might be a good moneymaker. So there's this fear of rage. There's also this fear of conspiracy. These two nations, Syria and Israel, the northern kingdom, have, verse 5, plotted evil against you. They have gotten together in secret, and they've formed a plan, and they're working out this plan. Later, Isaiah calls it a conspiracy. If you look at chapter 8, and verse number 12, do not say a conspiracy concerning all this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. So this power, a conspiracy against you. Again, I mentioned the publishing popularity of fear-mongering. And news, what kind of good news ever sells? People seem to only want to hear how troubled everything is. Conspiracies also are a big market. If you could come up with a good conspiracy, apparently people want to see conspiracies behind everything. They want to know, there's some plot, there's some kind of deep hidden plan. And of course, I think you could probably sell a few books by detailing how many conspiracies there are in the world. So Ahaz and his people are sure there's a conspiracy. What can we do? The people are plotting and everything's set against us. And then you also see that there's these threats, that there's verbal threats of this happening. In verse number 6, let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves and set a king over them, the son of Tabal. So they're going to attack the wall. They're going to break down a part of the wall. They're going to invade the city. They're going to overthrow the government, and they're going to establish a new king in the city. So fear that's causing them to shake, fear of the rage of the world, fear of the conspiracies, people plotting and joining together, the threat of what they plan to do before them. The troubling part of all this from a spiritual point of view, of course, God doesn't want his people to be upset all the time, but the fear isn't so neutral of a thing as only upsetting us. It also has the danger of ruining our relationship with God. And that is because that fear can cause us to compromise. Fear can cause us to make a pact with God's enemies. That fear can make us seek a security that the security is a bigger problem than the threat itself. Now, actually, Isaiah in his book doesn't tell us exactly that this is happening, but we know it's happening because he's writing in the context of a story that 2 Kings tells us. If you look at 2 Kings chapter 16, you see this historical setting for what Isaiah is recording in his book. 2 Kings chapter 16. And verse number 5, then Rezin, king of Syria, you remember him from Isaiah 7, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, you remember him from Isaiah 7, came up to Jerusalem to make war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, captured Elath for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath. Then the Edomites went to Elath and dwell there to this day. So, notice what Ahaz does in the historical narrative. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tilgath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who rise up against me. Now that verse is why Isaiah has been told to go to Ahaz. Because what Ahaz is doing is he's finding another worldly power to resist the worldly powers that he's most afraid of. So he's going to the world in order to ease his fear of the world. That's called worldliness. That's when you can't see past the world. You can only think in terms of its power. The world's threatening me, so I'm going to go to the world to seek some kind of rescue from it. So there's this fear of compromise, or this fear that leads to compromise, which is why the whole passage here exists in Isaiah, because it's the very thing that God has warned his people not to do. That Satan wins battles by making us afraid and then offering some solution to our fear, some solution to our problem that we get on his terms. And so God is warning all people, because Ahaz now is exhibit A of how not to treat fears when they come. So moving back to Isaiah 6, the whole context of this passage is really addressing this fear. And the context begins back in chapter 6, which we oftentimes separate out of the narrative because it's just such an amazing chapter. Isaiah 6, this vision of God, is inspirational and it's well worth treating on its own. But Isaiah 6 is really set in the context of this problem, of the nations warring against Israel, the temptation, or Judah, the temptation for God's people to look to another worldly power. That's the context where Isaiah 6 is set. Well, what do we read and what do we find in Isaiah 6? Look with me as I read through it. Again, it's an amazing and a very important text in the Old Testament and all the Scriptures. Isaiah 6, verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. With 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So I said, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which is taken with the tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. In this text, God is preparing Isaiah to give a message to all of his people. And it's a message that's directed particularly to help Ahaz, to help the children of Judah at this time. And it begins with this vision that Isaiah gets of God, of God's throne. So from an earthly level, you get generals, and you get battering rams, and you get archers, and you get swords, and you get chariots and horses, and you get planning rooms and throne rooms. And the way God's going to address that kind of worldly perspective is to bring our eyes up to the throne of God, to a higher place of dominion. So whatever happens in human quarters of power, whether it's on Capitol Hill or in the White House or in some foreign place of power. God saying, take your eyes off of this and look up to this throne. And Isaiah is given a vision of this. And what does he see? What does he see when God shows him his throne room? Well, he sees this overwhelming image of God's greatness, of God's incomparable status, of impossibly more vast than any human, anything any human picture could give. And so he sees this picture of God exalted above all. God so immensely high, we really don't even quite see God. What we see is the train of his royal robe flowing out of heaven down to the earth and filling up the temple. I mean, how large must this throne be? How large must this ruler be if his royal robe covers the entire scene? We can just imagine how much greater is this one who occupies this robe. And so his robe extends down to the earth, fills the temple, and it's this picture of awe. It's a picture of God exalted. So in all the rigors of human powers, this power is exalted over all those other powers. And we hear that these guardian angels, these seraphim, are crying out again and again, holy, holy, holy. Incomparable, incomparable, incomparable. There's none like this. God is absolutely sovereign. There is no other power. There's no other king. There's no other judge. There's no conspiracy. There's no joining and plotting of different powers together that's going to overthrow this. There's no one like the Lord. And if you could sum up the book of Isaiah, it would be this: holy, holy, holy. There's none that can be compared to God. Holy as a word means incomparable. It's not, there's nothing like it. It's set apart from every other power. And it's just preached again and again in the book of Isaiah. It's the primary vision. It's the answer to worldliness. Worldliness only sees human power. Holy, holy, holy extends our vision to a power that's far beyond it, that makes the human power seem minute, as Isaiah later in his book in chapter 40, where he says, in relationship to God is holy, 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 the nations are but a drop in the bucket, that they are like a handful of the sea in God's hands, or a few grains of sand. That's the world before God. That there is no power that can even be properly compared with God. So the vision is God is sovereign over all. It's an awesome vision, and that awesomeness produces fear. That Isaiah immediately resounds with. The whole place is shaking. The pillars of the temple are shaking at the moving of God's presence, and Isaiah is overwhelmed with that, and he is devastated by this image as God is exalted and holy. So it produces a fear. Every now and then we hear some people that make claims they have encountered God in some way, and what I always look for whenever I hear those cases, and admittedly a bit of skepticism whenever you hear those things, is, did you shake and fall on your face? I mean, that would be the first thing that you would expect. Anybody that meets God, everybody that meets God, that's what happens to them, because God is an awesome power and an awesome figure. And his holiness, of course, also refers to his moral purity, or maybe it reveals the absence of our worthiness. Seeing this image, if you enter this presence, you have a sense of your own unworthiness to encounter this being, and Isaiah feels it and falls to the ground and cries out that he is undone. He's coming apart because of this image is too powerful. It's too great, and he feels unworthy. And he especially talks about his lips. His lips are unclean. Now, why are his lips unclean? My hunch is his lips feel unclean because he's probably said things about God that now he's reconsidering. He's made some claims about God. He's talked about God. He's taught about him in the temple. He's preached about him. And all of a sudden he realizes that my words have not matched what I've just seen. That I have spoken impure things about God, or my language is not measured up to how great God is. It is a great challenge for anybody that teaches the Bible or teaches about God or preaches about God to try to come up with language that's worthy of God, that gives the right impression, that gives an accurate view of God. And I have a feeling that Isaiah feels impure in his lips because he has probably felt he's blasphemed by not giving a proper view of God, has not exalted God enough, and the people that he lives with have not either. People of impure lips. Yet, in this, God speaks good. That God graciously commands the seraphim to purge the lips, to cleanse the lips of Isaiah, to purify his speech. Tongues from the altar, a symbol of atoning sacrifice. God has spoken atonement. He has arranged a message or a work of good, and then he's spoken good by promising good to his people, and now he's commissioning Isaiah to get up and to go and take his message to his generation. So this view of God's throne is a vision of God's exalted greatness, his holiness, his awesomeness, the reverence that is produced by his presence, and then cleanses Isaiah's lips and tells him to go and speak to the people for him. Well, what do we do with this? Well, the obvious implication is to trust this God. It's the common theme of Isaiah, is that if God is so much greater and God has such a good plan, that our response is to trust him and to receive the peace that trust brings. And so we see that if we look back at chapter 7, we see this challenge that Isaiah speaks, having seen this vision, and now he's going to speak this vision to this particular case of Ahaz fearing and trembling in the world's threats. We see him being called to trust God. So the basic thought is to fear God more. To fear God more than we fear the world. To fear God more than we fear the chaos of the world, or we fear conspiracies of the world, or fear malevolent powers of the world, or fear oppression of the world. Now, the thought is to fear God more than these things. Look at me at chapter 8. That's carrying out this vision and preaching this vision of this God confronting this fear. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 11, "For the Lord spoke thus to me with a strong hand and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, do not say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. He will be as a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel." So the challenge of Isaiah's vision about God is you have your choice. You can fear the king of Syria and the king of Israel up north. You can fear these conspiracies. You can fear the power. You can fear the chariots and the battering rams and all that. You can fear whatever's happening politically in our country. Who knows where it's going to go. We hope it's, we've worked out things before. We hope it'll work out again, but we're not sure. But God says, take your eyes off of all that and put it on my throne and fear me more. Fear me more. In fact, have your fear so much that these conspiracies hardly even move you, that they don't seem like such a big deal. It's just what people do. Children conspire, and nations conspire, and to God it's all the same thing. Fear God more. Let Him be your fear. And don't call a conspiracy, not that they're not conspiracies, I'm sure they are. Isaiah is saying, don't let it be something that's a big concern to you. Don't let it be something that troubles your soul. Don't let it be something that upsets you, that you think, oh, something terrible has happened. What are we going to do? Well, what you do is you fear God more than all those other things. He tells us that we should be quiet and we should listen. In chapter 7, in verse number 4, God tells Isaiah to go to Ahaz and say to him, take heed and be quiet. Be quiet. Be of still soul. Don't be agitated. Don't get yourself all upset. Don't start speaking angry words because they're coming from a heart that's all distressed. Don't go running to everybody saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? These terrible things are happening. He says, be quiet. Later in Isaiah, he puts it in that phrase, be still and know that I am God. The same thought is to be quiet, to be peaceful, to be at ease because you're not so concerned that some terrible thing is going to overtake God's good plan. Be quiet and listen. Listen to the Word of God. Listen to the voice of God. Listen to the promises of God. Let those things be the things that you concentrate on. Of course, the whole image is one of humility. Isaiah himself, when he sees the Lord, falls down in contrition and with a repentance. Woe is me, for I am undone. That vision is appropriate always for the presence of God to humble ourselves, to bow before God, to humble our soul before God. And then he uses kind of an interesting expression about these powerful figures that are threatening. In verse number 7, for thus says the Lord, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken, so that it will not be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. So God's saying all this is going to come to an end. Notice what he said earlier in verse number 4. Take heed and be quiet, and do not fear or be faint-hearted, for these two stubs of smoking firebrands. He says, don't fear because they are like sticks that you might use for roasting marshmallows, and they've been used too long and they've burned down to the end. And they're still hot and they're still making some, smoke, but they're almost at their end. And you'd be foolish to be overly concerned with these smoking firebrands because they're of no great account. So God says, don't fear these burning embers. They're not only not going to harm you, within a couple of generations, they're not even going to exist. They won't even be known anymore. 65 years, they will be gone. And so you're fearing them that they're going to take over and be some tremendous power that is going to dominate you. Not only is that not going to happen, they are not going to last very long. That confidence should be a confidence that God's people bring to life, that whatever the world might think of itself or however it might speak, and this notion that people have a sense of the historical pattern of the course of history, or the story they think that's in their control. God can extinguish it like that, and He has before. And so God says, don't worry about these worldly. That's not where your focus should be. Take your mind and your heart off of fearing those kind of things. They are not your major concern. Rather, as we saw in chapter 8 and verse number 14, God, the Lord, will be as a sanctuary. God will be as a fortress. So he's urging the people to hide in God, to rest in God, to find their security in God, to wrap up one's heart in the secret place of the Most High, and to find great comfort and security there. And then one of the great themes of Isaiah 7 and 8 are these listing of children. You know, it's kind of interesting when you're reading Isaiah that he tells them, he keeps talking about children. So back in chapter 7, we see in verse number 3, and the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out and meet Ahaz and shear Jashub. And then in chapter 8, we hear about another son. Verse 3, I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Mahar Sha'al Hashbaz. And in between that, there's another child that's going to be called Emmanuel. So what is it with these children? Why are these three children found in the context of this threat against Israel? Well, children have very little military power. Children have very little, children are hardly the answer to political intrigues. Children are hardly the answer for social chaos. In fact, I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that there are something like 250,000 fewer pregnancies this year because of COVID. So everyone's afraid, and they're afraid in this time, and we're not having children because everybody's afraid. So, fear doesn't always go with children. What are these children doing in this story? Well, the children are there because they testify that God is doing something bigger than what we can do, and children are kind of represented that God's going to just take care of it. And we are going to be like children. And the children are going to be okay. The children are going to be provided for. There's going to be a future. The children are the way of talking about the future. The children are a vision of the next generation. So these three children are all symbols that Israel's going to have a future, that God's going to care for them like a parent cares for children. God's going to care for his people. And God is storing up an inheritance for them. So God's thinking of the next generation while Ahaz can't even see past the next day. He can't even see past this army. He can't even get past his fears. And God's saying, I'm building a people for you. And so these children are reminders that God is in control and God is with them. Now, of course, the most important of these names is this middle child in verse number 10. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. That's a rather sad verse. Basically, God says, I want to give you assurance. I want to give you hope. I want you to know that you can depend upon me. So ask something, no matter how deep or how high or big you can think of it, and I will assure you of my presence. And Ahaz has so little faith, he can't get himself to do it. He doesn't have enough trust. He thinks he's going to test God, that anything he asks will be too big. Anything he asks will be too hard. How could God do anything? How could God give me assurance here? But the Lord responds anyway. Verse 13, and he said, hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So this child is going to be God with us. This child is going to be God with Israel. It's going to be God taking charge, God intervening, and doing it in a child of all things, doing it through a child of all things. Of course, ultimately, we see the picture here that God's answer for fear is not military, and it's not political, it's not a new economic system. It's the gift of a son. It's the gift of God with us. And that's God's assurance to Ahaz. It's God's assurance to all of us that God is going to give us a son who is going to handle the real battle. God's going to take the burden upon himself. And so the ultimate answer is God with us, God fighting our battles for us, God delivering us, even as God eventually did deliver Israel or Judah, even through Ahaz's lack of faith. Well, I trust that you're not lacking faith, that you're not stirred up in soul or worried or anxious or fretting, that you're not given to compromises of declining in your spiritual life, or you are withdrawing in some kind of shelter or in some kind of enclave of safety, but rather I hope that you're living boldly in the Lord and living in the confidence that God does all things well. And he has sent Emmanuel, God with us, to care for all of our needs, and therefore we can rest assured in him. Well, I don't know about you during these troubled times, but I'm at peace. I hope that you're at peace, because Emmanuel, God with us, is ultimately going to be the victor and is the victor. And he represents the one that's on the throne, that's above every throne, and the one with all glory. And his glory fills all the world, and all nations will tremble before him, our God. And so they are something, just a drop in the bucket compared to our God, so we need not fret and fear over all those world powers. I trust that you'll be confident in that. And I also trust that you'll join us for prayer here in a couple minutes as we turn over our medium from our live stream to our Zoom meeting, that you'll join us there and have a time of prayer with us. Thanks for joining us this evening. May God bless and give you a great week.